Hello, I'm Caroline Bressey. I'm a member of staff in the Department of Geography at UCL, and thank you for joining me. I'm just going to be talking a little bit about some of my research that I do in the Geography department. I'm a historical and cultural geographer, and historical geography might be something that you're not so familiar with, as it's not usually taught in schools. Cultural geography you might be more familiar with. Around migration, might think about social geography, but I sort of work on historical geographies of migration. I'm particularly interested in Black histories and multi-ethnic histories of Britain, particularly London, which is where I was brought up. And I'm particularly interested in those histories before 1948. Some of you might know that 1948 is the year that the Empire Windrush arrived, and it's very much associated with the sort of start of multicultural Britain. And I'm interested in the multicultural Britain that existed before that date. I'm also interested in histories of anti-racism in Victorian Britain. You might have done work on the Victorians over your time at school. I did too. I'm very interested in the Victorians, but thinking about anti-racism again is perhaps not something that we associate with Victorian activism. You might have done work on the Chartists, you might have done work on people interested in social reform in the late 19th century. The anti-racist community isn't one that normally gets so much of a look in. And Catherine Impey, who's the woman on the front cover of my book, who's a woman who was born in Somerset and created this really radical anti-racist community from her home there, is someone that I've been very interested in. I'm also interested in what you might call cultural landscapes and public history. So why is it that we know so little about these histories usually? Why aren't they taught at school, like it's either part of our history courses or our historical geography courses? I'm interested in how those histories are represented in museums, and also public spaces. So, do they ever appear in memorials, blue plaques, statues, those kinds of aspects of public history in urban landscapes? That's led me to do some curating in museums. I've curated work with a colleague, Dr. Gemma Romain, who you can see in the image here. We did an exhibition at Tate a few years ago. I've also been involved, not that often, but done some TV work, and for example, like talking about the experience of a black woman who's a land girl on wartime farm. But I'm also interested in thinking about how the absence or presence of diverse histories in museums and in public landscapes more generally speaks to the geographies of racism that we experience today. And with my colleague and friend Claire Dwyer, we edited a book on new geographies of race and racism, which brought together a number of people that we felt were looking at contemporary racism from different perspectives, thinking about identity through religion, gender, and class, as well as my chapter, which was thinking about the history in the present. But what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today is particularly historical geographies of multi-ethnic Britain. And I've looked at that in various perspectives over the last decade or so. I look a lot at images, both photographic from the late 19th century and portraits, and that's because it's actually quite difficult to access Black histories or diverse histories through what we might think of as normal means. If any of you have family members that have looked at doing family histories, you might have been asked to help them with some digital archives like the National Census, baptism records, and so on. But in those records, although there are many of them and you can get a lot of information from them, it's very unusual to find references to the colour of a person's skin. Our ethnicity wasn't something we recorded in the census until very late, actually, in the 20th century. So images are a way to sort of try and find different kinds of histories that aren't written down in the same way. And some of that work has come through projects looking at UCL's own archives, particularly work that was undertaken by students at the Slade School of Fine Art. The Slade School of Fine Art was one of the first art schools that admitted women, and also one of the first art schools that allowed women to express and undertake the different kinds of art studies. the Slade School archive reflects the diversity of some of that work, both the artists that were here at UCL, but also the models that came into the studios to sit as artist models. And with my colleague, Dr. Gemma Romain, we did a couple of projects. One was looking at thinking about remapping Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury, some of you, particularly those of you that have read English, might know a little bit about the Bloomsbury group, the sort of literary stars of the early 1920s and earlier, who were part of a kind of literati around what is now UCL. But Bloomsbury wasn't just about that. Of course, there were lots of students historically attached to UCL and other colleges around London, but also a large working class population. Some people, activists, coming to use the British Museum, the British Library reading room, which was then part of the British Museum. It's now located not far from UCL at King's Cross, and students are lucky that we can still use that. But also working class people who would have been servants in those homes, indeed employed at UCL, but also the ordinary people that might have come in to sit for paintings, like the man in this image. Don't know much about him. When Gemma and I had originally taken on the project, we hoped that UCL might have an archive full of receipts and details, so we might be able to find out about these individuals, but unfortunately those don't survive. But we do get something of a sense, we hope, of a Black presence in the interwar years of a young man. Perhaps he was a student at UCL or another one of the London colleges. Perhaps he worked in the city. Perhaps he was just dressed particularly smartly for this particular image. And then what we tried to do is, when we found out a little bit more about some of the histories, old student unions where Indian students used to stay, important sites, we remapped those onto rethinking Bloomsbury connections, and remapping the city through a multi-ethnic lens is something that we're really interested in doing. We've also looked at Harlem in London, so the important African-American movement, the Harlem Renaissance, which inspired people living in urban centres and beyond in the United States and Europe. London hasn't been so much interrogated. People know pretty well of the African American presence in Paris, but the influence of jazz and the way it played a part in interwar Britain is not perhaps as well known as we might think it could be. This is a picture of Florence Mills, who was a young African-American star who became a massive star in Britain as well. She came both to perform in Dover Street to Dixie in 1923, despite the opposition of the British Actors Federation at the time, who said they thought it was inappropriate for an all-black cast to be performing in Britain. And they insisted on the shortening of the programme and that it included white performers. But Florence Mills returned with her team later in the 1920s and became a huge star with a show called The Blackbirds. But she also spoke out about anti-racism while she was here and generated huge amounts of fan mail. And so Gemma and I were really intrigued to read through all sorts of British fan mail, people who were inspired to write to Florence Mills for all sorts of different reasons, people who found her to be an inspiration because she was a black woman performing on stage, working class white men who found her an inspiration because she was a rags to riches success story that they could read hope into, or young women experiencing lesbian desire for the first time who wrote to her to tell her that they had fallen in love with a woman, they'd fallen in love with her for the first time. But some of you might say, but that's not the 19th century. And I was kind of specific about talking about the Victorians. And that is where my own research started in the 19th and 20th century. The Victorians is a period that we know so much about. We taught about it so much at school, but we don't really know that much about the diversity of the black presence there. And as I said, it's pretty difficult to find material on it because of the way archives have been constructed in the past. And one of the ways that I found I could get into it was through photographs. But the photographs that tend to record these histories are ones that were institutions that kept regular photographic archives. And at the end of the 19th century, those tended to be institutions of the state, where often people wouldn't have given their permission really to have their photographs taken. And they tend to be places associated with people who are fairly marginalised. So perhaps young people who've gone into children's homes, who've been taken into care, people in asylums, as Miriam and John are here, or people in prisons. But I've recently revisited some of this work in asylums because I've realised that there's a broader diversity than I was initially interested in. So in the early years of my work, I was really very focused on the Black presence in Britain. I wanted to know more about what people who from the African diasporas you might think of, as my mum was coming from Jamaica and me as a young Black woman, where were our histories in London. But going back to the asylum archives, I realised there's a much greater depth of diversity in those histories. There are histories of young Jewish people who've been taken in, and Jewish people who are British, but Jewish people from Russia who have relatives living all over Europe. There are the histories of people from South Asia, of young men working as sailors and finding themselves stuck in London when they haven't been able to find new jobs. And there are stories of ordinary Londoners of Irish descent, of Scottish descent, of Cornish descent, who find themselves in the asylum for all sorts of reasons. A lot of people are in the asylums for relatively short spaces of time. It's not necessarily a place where people get incarcerated and they never come out again. It's for many people a place where they go for a relatively short space of time. And that would seem to be the case of John, who is in the picture here. He was taken to the City of London asylum in the 1890s. People found it very difficult to speak to him. An interpreter was brought, but they clearly found it difficult to communicate with him because at first they thought he might be Spanish, but then they weren't sure. And eventually they've decided in his records that he's a Filipino. He was a young man in his 20s working as a sailor, and it's likely that he'd been working a job which had arrived in London, and then he couldn't find another job to take him home or to work another passage somewhere else. And so, found wandering by the police on the streets, he was taken to the asylum, and eventually he was released, and perhaps he stayed in London, or perhaps he did find another job and set sail to another port, perhaps in Europe, perhaps somewhere else in the world. Miriam's a more interesting character because Miriam is someone who was a private patient. So as a Black woman, that was fairly unusual, but also she is defined as a Jewish woman, and it is very unusual to find a Black Jewish woman who was a private patient in the archives. So I was very intrigued to try and find out more about her, and I'm kind of stuck. I think she's related to the Beresford family, who had a member of their family write a book about the Jewish diaspora in Jamaica. It seems likely she was connected to that. But a little bit more about her I haven't been able to find out. But trying to trace her trail through the National Census archives has taken me on a very different path of research. So looking for Miriam in the National Census, I found a Miriam who lived with her brother, as this Miriam did. But unlike my Miriam, who lived in Lewisham, this was a different Miriam who lived in Islington. She lived on Beresford Road, which you can see depicted in two different ways here. On the one hand, you see it as it is today-ish, from a still from Google Maps, Google Earth, and the other representation is taken from the Charles Booth's London Poverty Maps in 1898. Beresford Road has become a very interesting street to me, and it's something that I teach about in one of the first year lectures. It's an interesting road because it represents some of the diversity that I've been so intrigued in finding. So Miriam and her brother, who lived on the street, were were Jewish. They had other Jewish neighbours. But on the street, which you can see is marked red, and in the Booths London Poverty Survey that was undertaken, that meant they were comfortable, well-to-do people who were living there. There are quite well-to-do families living on the street. But interestingly, some of the houses are already subdivided at that point, and you have young women boarding as clerks, living on their own as boarders, as clerks. There are people from Denmark, there are people from Japan, there are businessmen from Poland, there are women from Newfoundland, people from all of over the world living on this one street. And I'm intrigued to try and find out whether it's a microcosm of London life or if it is really a one-off. But it's taken me to all sorts of interesting people, like a young actress originally born in Bristol who migrates up to London and stays on the street. She's a boarder in another house full of people from all parts of the country and across Europe. And she works in a theatre in Hackney, which it happens that Charles Dickens writes about in one of the many stories that he writes about London. This is actually a reference to one of his journalistic pieces when he walks the city and writes down and talks about the different places that he sees. And here is a sense of the theatre where she performed with sparkling chandeliers on a packed Saturday night. An audience of men, women and children, costermongers, mechanics, dock labourers, milliners, clerks and slot workers, poor workers in 100 highways and byways, all huddled in together to watch one particular actress. But perhaps on some evenings, and I do know that on occasion, they would have watched Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, some of you might know, was a very famous anti-slavery novel that's published in the 1850s, and it becomes a huge hit. It's originally published in America, but it becomes a hugely popular novel in Britain and all over the world. In Britain, as in other places too, it also becomes a stage production. And being an anti-slavery novel, there are parts for white characters, but also, unsurprisingly, of course, there are parts for black people. And so being able to follow Uncle Tom's Cabin around, despite all the problems and representations that such a novel might have, it's possible to find references to black men and women who were performing on stage in theatres all around the country. Of course, in the main cities like London and Bristol, and also in Glasgow and Cardiff, but also small market towns, smaller municipal centres, which all had their one theatre and were seeing tours of Uncle Tom's Cabin, some of the most successful performances of the era, having black characters in them. Is something really interesting to think about, how Victorians thought about race and how it was performed in front of them and for them. But alongside that, you also have something that perhaps we know a little bit more about of the Victorian era, and that's the circus. The circus was a place of romance, but also incredibly hard work and, of course, of danger. But one job that black men particularly might be able to find was work as an animal tamer. This wasn't easy work. It wasn't work just done by black men, and it was incredibly dangerous work. As you can see from the representation on the front cover of the Police News here, there were often catastrophic accidents when animals would turn on their tamers. Sometimes it wasn't at all clear why, and men would be very seriously disabled, having limbs ripped off and removed, or sometimes they would die. But it's interesting to think about who the black men who might have answered an ad in the paper asking for a steady man as animal keeper, one that will enter the lion's den if possible. Who were those men? They travelled with the circus all through the country, again, of course, to big cities, but to tiny rural villages and towns for country fairs and agricultural shows. What was their experience of living on the road in Britain and being part of a multicultural circus and part of a multicultural Britain? And here are some of those advertisements that you can find in the newspapers, and one image of a black man who was attacked by animals in one of those circus rings. These two images are quite contemplative and perhaps reflect some of the complexities of the research that I'm interested in. So, yes, I'm interested in how people lived together in an earlier time, and people certainly did. They were part of circus troupes that toured together. They were part of theatre productions that went all around the country, and they were applauded by audiences who stamped their feet and ran to the rafters to see them perform. But there were difficult times. And the image on the left of a young man, or a man in his shirt sleeves, as it's known, as part of the UCL archives, was also an image created by a student at the UCL School of Fine Art. It was painted in 1919, which is the year after the end of the First World War, and a year of great upheaval in Britain. There are race riots across the country. And I often look at this picture and think about, was this a man who had a son who had been on the front line in the First World War? Perhaps a daughter who might have been an ambulance driver? Was he someone who had come to be part of the war effort and then found himself the butt of extreme racism during the 1919 riots? The portrait of the woman was painted in 1920, just a year later. The Harlem Renaissance is about to bring jazz to the world. The 1920s is seen as a time of great creativity, of great excitement in many ways, but also still a time of great racial oppression, and the politics of anti-racism really struggling to find a voice, to find a pathway for equality for people. So although I'm interested in celebrating the histories that we may not know, I'm also well aware of the complexities and the difficulties. And of course, those critical historical geographies are also something that are really important to think about. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about the research that I do, and if you have got any questions, hopefully I can answer them at the Q&A. Thank you.